Hello, everyone, and good afternoon and welcome. As people continue to log in, we're just going to run ULI Toronto's Prop Tech Series webinar trailer, and then we'll get going with the program.
Having tools that allow you to better understand your operations and make more data-driven decisions will give companies an edge.
If you want to make a bigger impact, then we're going to go and understand people's behavior.
If the tool works and it enables you to do your job more efficiently, it will get adopted.
With so many people being inundated by technology and information, what wave do you jump on?
I think it's really important that we, as an industry, open up and be much more collaborative about the solutions that we apply.
Now is the time to create better, build better, and be better.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Richard Joy, Executive Director of ULI Toronto, and I welcome you to today's program, Extraordinary Achievements in Creative Placemaking. Today's program is also the official launch of the Artscape Foundation's first annual Tim Jones Creative Placemaking Awards competition, of which ULI Toronto is a proud partner, details of which will be announced this hour. As a Toronto region-based organization, we acknowledge that the land we are meeting on virtually belongs to the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people. Many of us have come here as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation or generations past. ULI stands in solidarity with the Indigenous communities demanding action and accountability for the ongoing legacy of the residential school system. We also acknowledge and honor those who've come here involuntarily, particularly descendants from those brought here through enslavement. And we want to flag an upcoming webinar this Thursday, Colonialism, Enslavement, and Abolition in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, the link of which we'll post in the chat. That's a free event. We're very, very proud to be presenting that this week. Finally, we recommend 3 programs that we've uploaded from the past to YouTube, and these also will be made available through the chat. 13,000 Years of Indigenous History in the GTA and Why It Matters to Planning and Development. More recently, Whose Land and Whose Law? And Indigenous Toronto, The Stories Our City Paved Over. 3 fantastic programs we hope you check out on YouTube. Before we start, I'd like to go through a few housekeeping items. Everybody, as expected, will be automatically on mute throughout the sessions to ensure that there's no audio interference. Closed captioning is available for this session. There may be a slight delay and it may not be 100% accurate. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A function or upload questions you see posted there by pressing the thumbs up button. We'll be looking to try to get to a few questions at the end of this program. This session is being recorded and will be sent to you following the session. It'll also be posted on YouTube for those not yet attending. And if you'd like to take the conversation online, please use our handle at ULI Toronto or the hashtag #AskGreatQuestions. Finally, I'd like to extend our sincere appreciation to our annual sponsors. Today's event and all other ULI programming would not be possible without their support. On behalf of ULI, I'd like to thank them for their continued support. ULI relies on the support of our sponsors to provide quality programming and to drive our mission of creating and sustaining thriving communities. To all of them, we say thank you. It's now my pleasure to turn the program over to Brooke Duval, Executive Director of Artscape Foundation, who's going to take over and provide a little bit of context of the competition ahead and set up our moderator to begin today's program. Brooke, over to you.
All right, thank you, Richard, and thank you, ULI Toronto. Before we introduce our speakers, Richard noted today that it is also the formal launch of the first annual Toronto Artscape Foundation Tim Jones Creative Placemaking Award competition. I'll have more details about this at the end of the webinar and encourage all potential applicants, or those of you who may know some great candidates for the award, to stay tuned through to 1 p.m. And with that, we'll now shift to the main program, which is very much designed to set the stage for the awards competition to follow. Moderating our panel discussion today is Gila O'Markell. Gila is Vice President, Social Impact at the Daniels Corporation, a leading GTA-based builder developer. She is responsible for strategic initiatives that look to ensure that the social, cultural, and economic infrastructures of communities built by Daniels are as strong as the new buildings. Since 2009, Gila has been working on the revitalization of Regent Park in Toronto's downtown east. The revitalization of the 69-acre social housing neighborhood to a mixed income and mixed use community is looked to around the world as a model for creating healthy, inclusive, and resilient communities. You'll hear more about this project in our panel discussion today. And with that, I'll now hand it over to Gila.
Great. Thank you so much, Brooke. And thank you to the team at ULI Toronto for having me today. I'm pleased to moderate today's panel, and it's going to be a great discussion. As we talk about community building and city building, many of us are hearing the term placemaking, or specifically creative placemaking, more and more. So before we get started, let me introduce you to our two panelists who I will be in conversation with today, followed with some Q&A from the audience. We encourage you, as Richard said, to submit questions through the Q&A function through the course of the discussion, and feel free to sort of like questions and bump them up so we can make sure to address them. So to kick it off, our first panelist is Tim Jones, former CEO of Artscape. A changemaker, social entrepreneur, and thought leader, Tim Jones has made a profound impact and unique contribution to the arts, culture, and urban development communities in Toronto, Canada, and around the world. As CEO of Artscape between 1998 and 2001, Tim coined the phrase and helped build the practice of creative placemaking in order to help artists and cities better thrive by leveraging the power of arts and culture as catalysts for change and in urban and community development. And I'm thrilled to say that I've had the pleasure to work with Tim now over 10 years and on quite a few remarkable projects, which we'll touch on today. I also have the pleasure of introducing our panelist, Jamie Bennett, who is currently the interim president and CEO of United States Artists. Previously, he served as the executive director of Art Place America, a 10-year fund that invested some $150 million in enlisting artists as allies in equitable community development. So with Tim and Jamie, we are poised for a great discussion. And to get us started and lay the foundation for this conversation, I'm hoping Tim can actually take us through the origin of placemaking and where the term creative placemaking actually came from. Tim, over to you, please.
Well, thanks, Gila. And first, let me say thank you to Artscape Foundation and ULI for honoring me in this way. It's really such an amazing kind of honor, and it's hopefully will help build a future generation of creative placemakers in the years to come. Placemaking as a term really, for those of you who aren't sort of familiar with the history, really kind of emerged in the 1960s by people like Jane Jacobs and others were promoting kind of this new approach to planning, design, and management of public space. It really kind of grew out of a frustration at the time with the urban planning practice. You know, it was a time when sort of it was kind of becoming more professional, and the disciplines within urban planning, traffic planning, and sort of other forms of urban planning were becoming increasingly fragmented. So, you know, the complaints sort of for the people who were advancing placemaking was that planning was too top-down, too uncoordinated, too chaotic, and it was resulting in public places that had no sense of place, that were unloved, or even sort of examples of blight. And that idea of placemaking was picked up by the new urbanist movement in the early 1980s, who were promoting kind of development that was more human scale, that was walkable, mixed use, sort of bringing housing, retail, and in some cases industrial together, really promoting kind of access to public space and designing spaces and places for people, not just cars. So that really kind of, I think, fueled the interest in placemaking. And the idea was that in order to actually create successful places, you have to be intentional about it. You can't just leave it to all these forces to magically put something together. And there needs to be a strong focus on design and community engagement, indeed collaboration. Another organization called Project for Public Spaces, American organization, did a lot of work in advancing the idea of placemaking, and they particularly around farmers markets and public squares, bringing a whole lot of new kind of knowledge about how to create successful places. And in 2006, sort of at Artscape, we started talking about placemaking as creative placemaking, as a kind of a subset of the larger kind of practice. And we weren't just talking about doing placemaking in a creative way. We were trying to kind of say to the world that there's actually a specific body of knowledge and kind of field of practice that's about leveraging art and culture for change in urban and community development. This wasn't an entirely new idea. It was something that sort of others had called city building through the arts or culture-led culture-led regeneration. I'm really thrilled to share the podium today with Jamie Bennett, because he and I both have some kind of history in that kind of proliferation of this idea, sort of certainly across North America. I was kind of in cahoots with the Canadian Embassy in Washington, sort of, I think it was around 2010. We concocted this kind of a panel discussion that I was part of. Richard Florida had moved to Toronto, and they were interested in promoting that idea. And there were a group of us that were brought together. Carol Coletta was the moderator, Anne Gadwa, who's been written extensively on this topic, Rick Lowe from the Project Row Houses in Houston. And in the audience that day was Rocco Landesman, sort of, who was then the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts. And he got really excited about this idea. He was looking to kind of find a way to make the NEA more relevant to kind of in city building. And he latched on to this idea of creative placemaking. And the next thing we knew, there was word of tens of millions of dollars lining up, and Art Place America was created. And that's where Jamie comes in. Over to you, Jamie.
Yes, and thanks for that background, Tim. Jamie, maybe you could share your experience on creative placemaking and why is it important?
Absolutely, Hila, thanks for that, and thanks, Tim. Essentially, Rocco Landesman, chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, was an appointee of President Barack Obama. And President Obama's approach to the federal government in the United States was essentially taking in all of the above strategy, right? We wanted to make sure that all the oars were pulling in the same direction. And so our belief at the National Endowment for the Arts was that artists have a set of knowledge, skills, and ability that are also useful in non-art settings, but that are not always tapped, right? And so the example I sometimes give is, looking at some of the wonderful attendees on this webinar, there are a lot of sort of neo-urbanists on the call, folks that are thinking about, like, how do we come up with a way to do rapid prototyping? Right? How do we try something out in a semi-public space, get feedback on it, iterate, make some changes, try it again, and keep going, right? We're desperate to come up with ways for doing that. Well, for 2,000 years in the theater, we've called rapid prototyping rehearsal, right? So theater artists know how to do rapid prototyping, but we don't always tap them on the shoulder to bring them in when we need them in community settings. And so one of the examples that I sometimes give is there's a tribal housing authority that works in Anchorage, Alaska, that was introducing a new micro unit of housing, and they were trying to help the residents of Anchorage, Alaska get their minds around what that would look like. So they tapped a set designer to come in and create a one-to-one scale model of what this unit of housing would look like so that the public could actually work through it, right? Walk through it, understand what it feels like, and say things like, hey, that's really stupid. If you have the refrigerator door open, you can't also open the dishwasher. So can you move this here? And because it was created by a set designer out of 2x4s in Luan, you could easily move the walls and have folks come in. So that's a kind of example of tapping the knowledge, skills, and abilities that artists have innately and deploying them towards other uses. So that was really why it was so important to us in the US at the time to make sure that artists were also a part of these conversations alongside all of their other neighbors. And as Tim said, we, in one of the many examples of things that the US borrowed from Canada, we took this framing that Tim and the colleagues at Artscape had been using and sort of created a federal government grant-making program, the Our Town grant program that's still administered by the US federal government, and created this 10-year fund, Art Place America, that, as you said, invests about $150 million in projects all across the United States to do that.
Awesome. And maybe now we can go to some examples to see what creative placemaking projects actually entail and how they impact our cities and communities.
So, you know, creative placemaking is both a philosophy and it's a process that can help shape community. It can help create a sense of belonging, a sense of community. It can actually certainly enhance place distinctiveness. And these are the things that most make places attractive to people, but they also determine the value of them, of places, both culturally and financially. And it's really important to recognize that these things don't just happen by magic, and they can be, it's really the intentionality behind it that is so important to creative placemaking. You know, one of the kind of the projects that really led us to kind of coin this term creative placemaking was the Distillery District. You know, there have been many, Toronto's Distillery District, there have been many failed attempts to bring this place back to life, and it was purchased by a company called Cityscape in 2001. They kind of, they adopted a strategy of using the arts as the main driver of the redevelopment process, and their first call was to Artscape. We got on board along with Sandra Ainsley Gallery, Jane Corkin Gallery, and several others. Later, George Brown College and Soulpepper Theater got on board. And to make a very long story short, what was imagined to unfold over 8 years happened in about 18 months. The momentum that was created by the artists and the not just the artists involved, but the kind of the narrative that started to emerge about this project was really strong and positive and helped to dispel a lot of skepticism. There was so much momentum, but by the time that we opened 18 months after the first conversation we had with Cityscape, every square inch of the place had been leased, 440,000 square feet. We threw an opening party and 70,000 people showed up. And that's when the penny really dropped for me about the power and the value of arts and culture to actually affect change in urban and community development. And we learned so much about how it can be done in different places to achieve different results than that kind of more cultural tourism focus of the Distillery District. There are actually lots of other examples of this kind of creative placemaking that are about neighborhood revitalization. People may know the work of Theaster Gates and the Rebuild Foundation in Chicago. Here he really led, has been leading the revitalization of the Greater Grand Crossing neighborhood in the south side of Chicago. And the foundation really is led by three values: Black people matter, Black spaces matter, and Black objects matter. And they've been incredibly successful in getting their hands on buildings and transforming both the people and places in the process. I know, Jamie, you've had some experience with Theaster and the work in Chicago.
Absolutely. And just two of the things that I might lift up in addition to what you shared, Tim, is I think any of us who've worked on community planning and development, who've worked on sort of real estate development, one of the things that's hardest for folks is to imagine that tomorrow can be different, right? If you've experienced a neighborhood and it's been in the same kind of disinvestment, if you've experienced the same conditions for years and years and years, it's really hard generationally to get folks to believe that tomorrow can be different, to create the will to do some of these great developments. And one of the things that's kind of the magic of an artist of theater is that with a couple quick light interventions, he can begin to open up that possibility that tomorrow doesn't have to look a lot like yesterday. And so helping folks imagine, rehearse the future is one of the things that I think is really magical, on top of all the really important things that you shared about Black cultural narratives.
I love that idea, rehearsing the future. There's another great example in Detroit, which, as many of us know, has had its real challenges, particularly in the inner city. And an artist named Tyree Guyton there, through the Heidelberg Project, really kind of set his goals on improving the lives of people in the neighborhood through art, demonstrating that a community can redevelop and sustain itself from the inside out by embracing diverse cultures. And one of the things I love about this example is just the resourcefulness and the inventiveness of it. Sometimes with a coat of paint and some creativity, you can actually make a profound sort of impact on the community. There are all kinds of places that, as Jamie just said, experience this kind of decline and kind of sense of hopelessness. And one of the things that creative placemaking can do is restore a sense of hope about a community. The next example really to share is really Daniel's Spectrum, which is, as we like to call it, and Gila and I worked on this project together. It's a community cultural hub, which we describe as the heart of the Regent Park revitalization in Toronto. It really was kind of central to changing the narrative about this place, inspired by a grandmother, one of the chief instigators of revitalization in the community, who said to us one day, we get sort of how people think and talk about Regent Park. They read about us in the newspaper. What if we actually created a place here that made it normal to come into Regent Park? Not just a place for culture as a local resource, but a place that was rooted in Regent Park and open to the world. And that really kind of inspired the vision for this larger project. And I have to say that sort of, well, we're kind of tooting our own horns in some way. And this was really a labor of love between the Daniels Corporation, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation, Artscape, and members of the Regent Park community. The impact that this has had over the last 10 years has really been phenomenal. And it's Gila, what's your reflection on this as a creative placemaking initiative?
I mean, you said it in a word, Tim, pretty incredible. I think, what really stands out for me is something Jamie just mentioned about sometimes the challenge imagining that tomorrow can be different. And for me, it was really interesting that this was an idea that came from the Regent Park community. And when it was built, it didn't automatically sort of resonate with the community right away, the community that existed in Regent Park. And to the credit of Artscape and community members to really sort of open the doors and activate the space and really transform Daniel's Spectrum into a community living room. And what that really illustrated for me was that need, Tim, that you mentioned around intentionality. So, building the building is great. Creating the programming that responds directly to the community needs is better. And when we think of placemaking, how does it both respond to the place, but also to the people? And I think that's what Daniel Spectrum does so well.
Amazing. The next one is a really fine example of Indigenous placemaking, or as some would prefer to call it, Indigenous placekeeping. It was a project created by the Brooke McElroy in partnership with all kinds of organizations, including the Fort William First Nation, Red Sky Métis, and Robinson's Superior Treaty Communities. Really, it was designed to restore Indigenous visibility to the shores of Thunder Bay, and also promote Indigenous identity, worldviews, and values. And it's on top of everything, it's just a gorgeous space, but sort of it's a reminder that sort of, you know, we are not building on a few hundred years of history, but literally tens of thousands of years of history. And Jamie, you mentioned another project in Alaska. Sort of, there's a lot of work happening around Indigenous placemaking and placekeeping, and I think we need so much more of that, sort of as we look to the future. Here's another one that by American artist Magda Sayek. And this was a project that was produced by in Austin, the Ballantyne Museum of Art. And this artist describes her practice as yarn bombing. You've heard of photo bombing. This is yarn bombing. And she's really kind of says it's like graffiti with grandma sweaters, really knitting up a storm, really engaging more than 140 different collaborators to give these 99 trees in a new plaza a different look. Again, just amazing. And there are lots of different examples of this kind of thing. And, you know, what this artist, Magda, is really kind of, you know, the world of graffiti sort of is often a male-dominated kind of world, and she's really proud to be offering a kind of more feminine side to kind of that practice of actually imprinting ideas and a new look on places through yarn bombing.
And we have lots of sort of designers and architects and planners on the call. So hopefully these examples start inspiring ideas of the many canvases we have around us for placemaking.
If anyone's been to Montreal recently, you may, and traveled down St. Catherine Street over the last number of years, you may have experienced this next example, 18 Shades of Gay by Claude Cormier, the amazing artist and landscape designer. Toronto folks will know Jamie through his work on Sugar Beach and other projects. In this one, believe it or not, sort of they've made use of 180 balls that stretch a full kilometer across the gay neighborhood in Montreal to completely transform the sense of place and add, if you could make the gay community more festive, I think Claude Cormier has found a great way to do that. So if you haven't checked this out over the last number of years, make a trip to Montreal and you'll see it. It's another great example from a project that I've followed for many, many years called the City Repair Project from Portland, Oregon. They've actually done work all over the US. One of their most, they do lots of different examples of what you could describe as creative placemaking. One of their most prolific are these, what they call intersection repair projects, really kind of taking new ownership and working with the community to reimagine them in all kinds of different ways and add some real distinctiveness and to create community in the process. And so, Jamie, have you had any other experience with the City Repair Project and their crazy and wild projects?
I haven't come across them specifically except through you, Tim, which is a huge sort of lacuna in my professional life, but know some other folks that are doing similar work with transportation, reclaiming streets, and I just love this.
Speaking of transformation, or transportation, Jamie, I know that you were involved in funding kind of projects that involve, you know, major transportation kind of disruptions and the use of creative placemaking as a kind of bit of an antidote to some of the displacement. Do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, and I think we might even have an image if we go ahead a couple of slides of the Springboard project.
Okay. So
and just if folks want to see that, and then we can come back to this. But St. Paul, Minnesota, this is one. St. Paul, Minnesota is one of the twin cities, one of the two big cities in Minnesota. And they were extending their light rail. They had a spur of that called the Green Line that was going to connect the Lower Town neighborhood to the rest of the cities. And now that it's open, it's a fabulous amenity. But any of us who've lived near a major infrastructure construction problem know that the sort of 18 months of construction is sort of mind-numbing, right? You just want to rip your hair out. It's inconvenient, it's noisy, it's messy. So what this local group did is they worked with 600 local artists, and they trained them on how to self-produce and how to partner with small businesses and community organizations. And then over that 18-month construction period, they sent them out and said, do whatever your art practice is, just do it along the construction corridor, right? So those 600 artists produced events that range from a jazz concert in a Thai restaurant to a dance lesson in a parking lot to a stained glass visual artist installation on a construction fence. And what they discovered, essentially using Google Alert, is that those artist interventions totally changed the narrative of what was happening with that neighborhood, so that no longer was Lower Town being mentioned within 5 words of traffic jam. Instead, it was being mentioned within 5 words of cool thing to do Friday night. So for a relatively low intervention, all of a sudden, this was no longer a terrible neighborhood to live in. This was sort of the happening place. All of a sudden, people were no longer staying away and going to businesses across town. They were coming for the jazz music and hanging out to buy the pad thai noodles. And perhaps most importantly, given the overall project, we didn't spend 18 months cutting off that neighborhood from the rest of the city. We spent 18 months creating patterns and habits of coming and going, so that when they opened the light rail, there was instant demand for it because people wanted to come and go from the neighborhood. So that's just a quick example of how you deploy some local artists to do that.
Amazing, just amazing. You know, there's another great example sort of that had a Toronto edition is the Inside Out project that was by a French artist named JR. And this actually was a global thing that reimagines cities as galleries, city walls as galleries. And Manifesto, the wonderful organization in Toronto, led the Toronto chapter of this. And there's still remnants of this project that actually happened in 2011. There's still remnants of this project in places around the city, including in my neighborhood of Leslieville. Quick other couple of examples, a project called Play Me, I'm Yours by British artist Luke Jerram, another global project that had artists kind of redesign pianos and turn them into street pianos. The Pan Am Games brought this project to Toronto, and again, there are still examples of street pianos around the city where anyone can just walk up and play a tune, and people gather around it. And it really kind of changes people's sense of the environment and their sense of ownership within it. And then finally, so the last example I'll share before handing it over to Jamie is this amazing project by the Matterhorn on the Matterhorn Mountain by Swiss artist Jerry Hofstetter. Really kind of, you know, we've all been through this crazy pandemic where the way that we think and act in public spaces probably been forever changed. And this was, I think, a great example kind of coming out of the pandemic of creative placemaking, of kind of inspiring people to think differently about place and create a sense of community even when we can't gather together in public spaces. So I love this kind of this example and think it's an extraordinary example of creative placemaking.
Awesome. Thanks, Tim. And I like ending with this one because it really reminds us how big we can think when it comes to placemaking. I know it's come up a few times already in our discussion, but that term intentionality, we've all touched on. And I'd like to dig a little deeper into that in terms of how intentional does creative placemaking need to be? Does it always need to be organized, or can it be organic?
Tim, do you want to take a swing at that, or do you want to break and let me dive in?
Well, yes. Why don't you dive in and I'll jump in after you.
So the two things that I'll say is that example I gave from St. Paul with the light rail, That was a project that worked with 600 local artists that were already living, working, worshiping, and playing in St. Paul, right? Oftentimes we can sort of get into this mindset that we need to sort of parachute in some extraordinary artist from some other place to do the work, when every community in the North America, around the world, already has artists working in it. So I just think the first piece of that I'd love to lift up is that you don't have to get an artist from over there in order to do some of this work. There are absolutely artists that are already in the neighborhoods that you're trying to work in. So I think that's the important thing. Second thing, in terms of intentionality, is, you know, systems default to work the way that they're designed. And we have, you know, a 400-year history, 500-year history on North America of systems on this continent only working for some of us. So I think if you don't come in with that intentionality of who you're working, who on whose behalf you're working, the system is going to default to working really well for the wealthy, right? And so one of the things that we were talking about in prepping for this is I'm the child of an English teacher and a librarian, so I think a lot about grammar and language. And I think prepositions are really important. And if you find yourself thinking about a project and talking about doing it to a community, that too is a real important leading indicator that's different than doing a project for a community, doing a project with a community, or having a community do a project by and for itself. So just, I think the organic nature absolutely can happen, and working with local folks is great. And I think that intentionality, and always sort of, we have colleagues at Policy Link, which is a sort of think tank in the US, who say before you start any project, you should have explicit answers to the 3 questions: who decides, who pays, and who benefits. And so I think having both intentionality and explicitness around answers to those 3 questions before you go into any project is hugely important. Tim, how would you round that out?
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. I think you can be both intentional and organic at the same time. Like, we're not engineering culture here, right? Through this process, what we're often doing with a project like Daniel Spectrum is creating a platform for cultural expression to emerge. You know, we learned that, you know, the intentional thing was learning that, you know, Regent Park had 56 different cultures of origin living in the park before the revitalization, speaking 47 different languages, but they had no place to express that. And so we built a place that was a platform for that. And then that kind of, the cultural impact is more organic, but the intention of actually doing it is very purposeful. The other thing, you know, and just building off what Jamie has said, is that it actually really matters who's leading this work. You know, creative placemaking done badly is creative place taking or art washing, right? If the motivation isn't kind of grounded in community benefit, and if artists themselves are being exploited in the process, then this is not a kind of positive thing. And you're going to do more harm than you're going to do good. So it actually does matter, kind of not only being intentional, but who's driving the bus and how are people being empowered in the process. And so that, you know, creative placemaking is about a kind of practice, a set of practices and processes that people use to, you know, we like to say at Artscape, to build the vision from the ground up in the community, so that it's not someone like me authoring the creative placemaking project. It's actually enabling others to do that. And that's, I think, really important thing to understand about the practice.
Yeah, and that's a great sort of distinction in terms of the enabling versus sort of the authoring and the doing. And I thank you both for sharing those insights in terms of some of the, you know, do's and don'ts around intentionality in creative placemaking. I know we want to get to audience questions, so maybe I'll start to wrap us up in terms of our planned questions, just to have you each comment on sort of how placemaking has changed. We talk a bit about the origins, but, you know, where are we today in placemaking, and where are we going, you know, hopefully coming out of a pandemic soon? What does that look like as it relates to people coming together or expressing themselves artistically?
I'll start. I think that placemaking is finally kind of, come to the fore. Like and thanks to Urban Land Institute actually as being a major advocate for this. Like it's becoming kind of, an accepted part of good sort of building complete communities. And but I would say that I think we're just at the beginning of the understanding around creative placemaking, about leveraging the power of art and culture as an agent for change in urban and community development. And there's some developers like Daniels who are really at the forefront of that, and others who are, and frankly also others in the arts community who are struggling to understand the process and the practice and how to kind of how to take advantage of it. So I think it's a kind of a growing thing, and we're also at a kind of unique time when the pandemic has really changed everything about how we think about and interact with public space. So it's both an opportunity to kind of do things in a different way. I mean, think about it. 2 years ago in Toronto, there were millions of us in the street celebrating the Raptors NBA victory. Like, that would now be seen as a public health disaster to do something like that. So how do we kind of reclaim public space and reinvent it? And I really think that artists and cultural organizations have a huge role to play as we kind of rethink our cities, sort of in the new post-pandemic world.
So, as usual, agree with everything that Tim said. And all I might add is my experience of the pandemic is that we don't have any new problems, but we have magnified the existing problems 1,000-fold. And so folks that have been unhoused for far too long, that is very clear to us during the pandemic about how dangerous that is. Folks who've been struggling with social isolation, that gets magnified during the pandemic. So these are all things that artists have been working on for a very long time. So what I feel coming out of this pandemic is not that we necessarily need to do different work, but that we need to be more urgent about it. Things that we should have fixed 50 years ago, we now need to get fixed. We need to fix some of the systems related to housing, related to public health, related to community wealth building that have really become so glaringly clear to us that are huge problems during this pandemic. So I just think that urgency is something that I would like to bring into the conversation.
That's a great one. And it sounds like collectively, we all have quite a bit of work ahead of us to do this together across industries and sectors. So thank you both for that. Let's turn over to questions. I'm excited to see 9 questions in the Q&A. You never know with these online panels. So great to have such an engaged audience, and thank you all. I'm going to sort of start with the questions being bumped up in terms of what are your takes on using culture as a tool to regenerate places, especially post-industrial sites? Are they usually successful? Tim, maybe if I could ask you to start with that.
Sure.
And I know we touched on the distillery, so feel free to build on that example as well.
Right. So, I think sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not so successful. As I said earlier, it really depends on who's leading it. And there are a set of things that, that are important in terms of making these projects successful. One of the things that we use in all of our projects is bringing a critical mass of creative people together, sort of in order to have impact. That the creative placemaking projects need to be led by creative people, that you need a values-driven approach, that you kind of design the project to deliver value to multiple people through kind of shared value, and that you're very collaborative. And so I think those are the keys to success for projects, and projects that do that successfully sort of are more likely to be successful than not. But not everybody takes that approach. So, that I guess that's the best answer I could give on that, to that question.
No, and that's a great one.
And I might just jump in. I was born in Cleveland, Ohio. So those post-industrial Rust Belt cities around the Great Lakes are especially close to my heart. And so I think about sort of a macroeconomic overlay to it. And when you think about those communities, what often made them successful in the past was having one major industry, the steel industry, coming in and doing it. And I think one of the things that's clear to all economists looking forward is that the next big thing is going to be 1,000 little things, right? Because there are essentially two theories of economic development. You can either become more efficient or you can innovate. And in those post-industrial Rust Belt cities, we did all the efficiency we could do. We got down to the bone, organized labor. That's why those industries are no longer thriving in the way they have. So artists, what they do all day, every day in their studios is innovate. So thinking about investing in artists as essentially light, small scale manufacturing, rather than investing in major industry, I think is going to be a part of the economic redevelopment of many of those post-industrial cities.
Great, thank you. And then just, I'm gonna jump up because we're liking questions live here. In terms of what guidance could you offer to professionals engaged in placemaking to support the selection of a specific type of artist or art or artists who should decide this? And this goes to another sort of theme we've been talking about around decision-making and leadership. So who actually decides the art, and what does a good selection process look like?
And I can jump in, and I'll just say, I think in many ways, Hila, this goes back to your question around intentionality, right? And that what we're saying with these creative placemaking projects is there's something that we want these artists to help achieve, right? And so thinking about what is that outcome, what is the thing that we're hoping the creative placemaking will help us roll up to, is the thing that will be so important in terms of doing the artist selection. So there's another transportation example. I know Tim and I went back and forth, but there was a local Department of Transportation that wanted to rethink through streetscapes, right? How do we make complete streets that are useful to automobiles, but also to bicycles, and also very much to the human body, right? Who are the artists who understand the human body maybe better than anyone? Are dance makers. So the Department of Transportation actually brought in some choreographers to work with the traffic engineers and said, what would it look like to create a physical space where both cars and human bodies could thrive, right? So thinking about that sort of set of knowledge, skills, and ability, what is the problem? What is the thing that you're trying to solve, to crack, on which to innovate, and thinking about which kinds of artists are the best to bring in. And then I would say, you know, anyone who's involved with real estate development selects colleagues to work with all day, every day. But sometimes when it comes to artists feel other or different, and we sort of leave behind our common sense, right? We would never ask an engineer to do drawings for free. We're never going to ask an artist to do their work for free. You know, we would bring in the kind of engineer we needed for the project hand. We would bring in the kind of artist we need for the project hand. So I think it's a hugely important question, and it's not so different from all of the other selections that we're making over the course of a development project.
Great.
With many of these kind of questions, though, what you probably need to think about is what is the process you're going to use to get to the outcome that you're trying to achieve, and how do you empower people in the process? Hila, you'll know that sort of with Daniel's Spectrum, one of the first things we did was create a community steering committee. People in the community who heard of our intention to create a place for culture quite rightly said, who the heck are you to come into us and tell us what culture means in our context, especially in this, rapidly, or this, this area that's going to go through rapid revitalization. And so it was important for us to kind of create a steering committee and empower them, and then subsequently develop a community engagement process and a kind of governance and community stewardship plan that gave local people a say in in what was going to evolve there. So this is kind of it's a design question, really, that was posed here. How do you design sort of a process to actually achieve that kind of that kind of outcome and to actually empower people in the process. There are lots of different ways to do it, but at Artscape, that's how we approached it, was through a process of designing community stewardship and engagement.
Absolutely, and I'll have to give a big shout out to the Artscape team here. We've been working on a project in City Center in Mississauga together around a large public art installation, and it's not sort of the mandated public art from the city. It's something that the developers are choosing to do directly on our own. And Artscape, through the process, put together quite a sort of selection committee that would help guide the decision making, including artists who live in the community themselves, as well as representatives from the city, in addition to the architect that designed the building. So we have all of those different perspectives. And what really struck me was, even with those different perspectives, we were able to reach a decision so quickly and so unanimously because of the questions that were being asked by each of the groups pertaining to their areas of expertise, that really highlighted the strength of one group in that selection process. So I think as we think of the outcomes and who we want part of driving those outcomes, that becomes important as well. And maybe we'll do one last question before we turn it back over to Brooke to learn more about the Tim Jones Creative Placemaking Award. And the question is, I work to bring children and youth into conversations and planning around outdoor spaces. Just wondering if you have any experiences of projects you've worked in where children were meaningful participants.
Jamie, do you want to start that one?
Sure, happy to. There are a couple projects, and I'll drop my email in the chat if folks want to follow up and get sort of specific references. But there was a really wonderful project in New Orleans, Louisiana, where the local arts council was working in a neighborhood where oftentimes the young people were defined incorrectly as the problem. Right? That's a neighborhood where there are a lot of bad kids, bad things are happening, all of that. And so this project actually trained young people to be urban designers. They said no one knows better what's happening on the streets than these young kids. And so if they actually know what the conditions are, they can actually be the solvers. So the New Orleans Arts Council did a project called Youth Solutions, where they actually empowered young people to go out and not only identify the things that needed to be better in their communities, but actually empowered them to come up with the solutions. There's a similar project in New York City with the happening out of the Abrams Art Center. It's called something like Perfect City. I might have that name slightly wrong. But again, young people are doing a process called avoidance mapping, where particularly young women, young females, girls are mapping the areas in their neighborhoods where they feel unsafe. What are the streets, what are the public spaces where a young single female might feel unsafe to be, as a way to begin lifting up some of the misogyny that happens in the way that our public spaces are designed and deployed. Because it's really, particularly for me, that's a whole thing that I had just sort of been totally blind to until these young women, until these girls had sort of started lifting that up. So I'll drop my email in the chat, and if folks want to connect with some of the folks doing that work. There's also a partner we have with Creative Generation, who's collecting a bunch of youth community development projects around the United States, who'd be happy to connect.
Great, thanks, Jamie. I think that would be super helpful. Tim, any examples you want to highlight specifically?
I think I'll leave it at that. Those were fantastic examples, and there's just such a wealth of stuff, particularly because of the work that Jamie has done in Art Place America and seeding this work and sharing the knowledge across the US, but it's spread across Europe and Australia and many other places as well. So there are no shortage of examples to look to in all the different areas, whether it's youth engagement, whether it's transportation, whether it's kind of large scale kind of district revitalization. There are plenty of examples to draw on in terms of achieving kind of extraordinary kind of results through creative placemaking.
Yeah, and that's a great way to wrap us up, Tim and Jamie. So thank you for a great discussion. I know I could at least talk about this for another 5-6 more hours, and seems like our audience could as well, given the number of questions. We will take the questions away to the ULI Toronto team. They may help, spur some further webinars and conversations, but thank you all for actively participating. And to Tim and Jamie for sharing your insights. Just to wrap us up before I hand it to Brooke, there were a few things that struck me as we think of the sort of process for placemaking in terms of who decides, who's leading, who pays, and who benefits. So for our sort of planners, developers, designers, and architects on the call, something to guide us all as we go forward in our placemaking practices. And with that, over to you, Brooke.
Thanks, Sheila. What an inspiring discussion, Q&A, and examples of creative placemaking that really set the stage for our awards competition. On behalf of Toronto Artscape Foundation and Urban Land Institute Toronto, I'm so excited to tell you more about the Tim Jones Creative Placemaking Award, which is a $10,000 annual award that will celebrate excellence in creative placemaking in the Greater Golden Horseshoe and honor Tim Jones's legacy. Eligible projects for the 2021 award will include initiatives that have demonstrated the use of arts and culture to advance positive change, growth, and transformation of place in the period between January 1st, 2020 and September 15th, 2021. While the award will recognize individuals, nonprofits, and private companies associated with selected projects, eligible recipients for the cash award will be limited to the artists and creatives involved in the project. We also encourage applications from individuals that represent the full diversity of communities in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, including complexities of intersecting identities such as ability, age, citizenship, class, gender, race, and sexual orientation. I'm pleased to share that the application portal is now open and closes September 17th at 5 p.m. For more information and to apply for the award, you can see the link here, but we'll put it in the chat as well. Please check it out. If you have any questions about the award itself, you can find contact information on our website, and you can email our team directly for a response. Please share this call for applications far and wide with your networks. Our selection committee looks forward to reviewing all applications. Thanks for joining today, and I'll pass it back to Richard.
Thank you very much, Brooke, and thank you to all our panelists today. That was a fantastic program, and I'm just so excited that this is also to the service of announcing the Tim Jones Creative Placemaking Award inaugural, which we will be featuring. The prize will be featured on the day of our first large symposium in 3 years on November the 4th. So super excited to be presenting this. Some upcoming events. We always have upcoming events. I mentioned at the beginning, and I really hope that most of you will be able to attend a very special event, Colonialism, Enslavement, and Abolition in the Greater Golden Horseshoe this Thursday. It's going to give you some foundational history that even someone like myself, who's immersed in history all the time, have learned a lot in the preparation of this program. So I really hope that you'll be able to tune into this. And then sticking with the placemaking theme, next Monday, we are actually doing a program that was going to also be to the service of another thing, and that was our first social event in many years, a couple of years. Unfortunately, we've postponed that in the abundance of caution. But nonetheless, the event, the business of placemaking, is happening next Monday, and I think you'll find that to be super interesting. And we're going to be sticking with placemaking even more so in the coming year. We have an annual effort called the Mid-Career Program, the Kirtner Urban Leadership Program for mid-career professionals. And we'll be opening up that very soon. But the coming year is going to be focused deeply on placemaking. So ULI is doubling down in this very important city building block. So with that, and we're almost at time, I thank everybody for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at an upcoming program. And for those of you who are interested in this competition, I wish you the best of luck.